We're continuing in this coffee table series, and last week I glued up my tabletop panel, all the parts for my base, and then I created the templates that I'm going to use to make all of the components for my base. I started off by cutting my table legs to length using this new sliding table that I've got. This was the first project where I ran the sliding table, and so I think I probably can't give you a really detailed and thorough rundown of it yet, but I can give you my first thoughts. I will say, if you have a mobile shop, I would not recommend getting this tool. The amount of time it takes to dial this thing in is crazy, and if I had to redo that work every day, it just absolutely would not be worth it. And as a matter of fact, the guy that sold it to me, that's why he got rid of it, is because he still rolls his table saw away at night so his wife can park into the garage, and he said it just wasn't worth the hassle. Secondly, there is this part of it that just it annoys me to no end. I do not understand why it's designed this way, but anytime you want to remove that bar off the sliding table, you have to dial it back into 90 degrees with your saw blade, and there is a way they could have done this differently, and I just don't understand why they didn't. I find that to be really, really annoying. With that being said, it does make cutting large parts really easy. Once everything is set up, which takes an extraordinary amount of time, it works really well. And it does make a really nice smooth cut. It does have a lot of nice features. Like, I really like the double stops and the micro dial things to adjust your stops. Like when you're trying to sneak up on a cut, those are really convenient. They flip up out of the way. So like if you forget to square off something, you don't have to like reset your stop. I also like the extendable fence because this allows you to cut really long things, and that's really nice. But yeah, it right now I can't say that I would necessarily recommend it. I can accomplish the same things I did with my crosscut sleds, and I just felt like those were less in the way, and once I set those up, they were good to go. Like, I've never had to adjust them again. So I'm not really sure how I feel about this tool yet. Once I finally got my fence dialed in, I squared everything up and then used my template to set the stop and cut all of my blanks to final length. So once it was cut to length, I took it over to the bandsaw to rough out the parts. And I'm going to just say, and this applies across the board, you should take the time to set up your tools properly. For whatever reason, when it comes to the bandsaw, I always think I can get away with like running a resaw blade while I'm trying to cut a curve, or like I don't need to retension the blade. This is just going to be really quick. And it makes such a difference on the cut. And so I definitely recommend taking the couple of minutes it takes to dial your tool in for the cut that you're going to make. The other thing I'll say, and again, this really applies to all tools, but I find it especially true on the bandsaw, it's something my dad told me: let the tool do the work. And so if you find yourself forcing the workpiece through the cut, then that means you're probably not dialed in properly, or you're trying to rush the cut. And you'll find if you just move at the rate of the tool, you're gonna get better results. So when you are roughing out these parts, you want to cut as close to your line as possible. I know that there's a tendency to really leave a lot of extra because once you remove something that you needed, it's really hard to repair that, whereas you can always remove more material. But it's a lot of work to do with a router if you leave a really big chunk behind. Just remember that when you're tracing your template onto your part, the pencil line already sits outside of your workpiece, and there is a thickness to your pencil line. So if you cut right up to the outside of the pencil line, you should still have plenty of wood left behind where you're not risking cutting into your workpiece. Okay, so here I'm laying out for the blocks that I need to cut to glue on here. So on my template, I accidentally got it backwards the first time, and you can see here I was drawing it out wrong. It didn't line up with that center stretcher. I had it like this, I guess. And so you can see that this was low on that thing. So I went ahead and marked it, so hopefully I don't make that mistake again. And then I'm just going to pull this away from the edge a bit to make sure that I have enough material, because remember that I have oversized this. And then I'm going to line this up with that center right there. And then I'm just going to go ahead and mark my template. So I know if I cut blocks about this big, I'm going to have enough material. And I'll probably oversize those as well. Maybe go like here, since I have it. And then also, before I make these cuts, I'm probably going to cut them like around here. I'm going to go ahead. So I don't know if you've seen, but over here, like I've labeled my boards to try to keep all the parts together. And I know, like I've done this before where I think, oh no, I'll know, I don't need a label. But oftentimes when things get separated, it gets very confusing. So I'm going to go ahead and label these also, just to be sure that I keep, it would just be a shame after all of that to lose the order. So I'm going to go ahead and mark a triangle so I know about where they go. And then also that this is on my right side. And then I'm going to do an A on my left side. These cuts didn't really need to be precise, so I just set a stop block at my miter saw and cut them all out. And then you can see here that by marking them, it was really easy to tell what block went where to keep that continuous grain pattern. I glued those parts up, and then I took the stretchers and the legs to my planer and ran them through to start thicknessing them. Whenever you do this, you're going to want to make sure and rotate your pieces so that you keep that glue line in the center. So what I'm going for here is, I think I want these to be, they need to be a square. So I'm going to keep milling until I get the same thickness as I have height here. Once I had those all cleaned up and thickness, I took them back over my table saw to get them to the final length. And I did that by just squaring up one end and then using my template to set my stop and get them to their final length. So once everything is cut to length and is nice and square off the table saw, I'm going to transfer my templates back onto my work pieces and relabel everything. And then once that's done, I can rough out the stretchers on my bandsaw. I don't know about you, but for me, a bandsaw is kind of like riding a bike. You know how you can turn really well in one direction, but turning the other way is super awkward? I feel the exact same way at my bandsaw. Like, I can hit my line really well if I'm working when I'm working on the right side of things, but if I have to work on the left side, for some reason, it really throws me. Now that everything is roughed out, I'm ready to do my joinery, and I want to glue these components together before I do my final routing, and that's just because I think it's going to reduce the cleanup I need to do where these two pieces come together. My joinery is going to be done with a Festool domino, and I know it's an expensive tool, and no, you don't need one to do woodworking. What I'm doing right here, the way I'm laying out my lines, you could actually do the exact same thing if you're going to use dowels. And the reason I mention dowels is that I think they are the easiest and most accessible joinery to beginning woodworkers. Maybe aside from pocket screws, but I hate pocket screws. I can't think of a single time I ever tried to join hardwood together without them cracking my workpiece. So if you're just getting started, I would say go get you a decent dowel jig and start with that. I will give a little warning about dowels though. In theory, they're super basic and simple and fast. In practice, they can be finicky. And the reason why is you need to get everything lined up exactly right. And I've always found that the toughest part of this is when you're trying to drill into end grain. Your drill bit tends to want to dance a little bit to follow the grain instead of put it exactly where you want it. So if you're going to do dowels, one little trick is just run your drill backwards for a couple of spins so that you're going to kind of like cut some fibers to try to keep that drill bit in place where it needs to go. I have absolutely no affiliation with Festool or the Domino, but as far as tools go, I think this is actually a really great tool. And for me, I define that by, high quality, and it takes some task and makes it faster, more accurate, and more consistent. And that's exactly what this tool does. I do understand the criticism that maybe it makes you a less skilled woodworker because you become reliant on this tool to do things, but I feel like you could say the same thing about a table saw or a router or any modern tool. It's made woodworking much easier. I have a couple of minor criticisms about things like the balance, where the location of the dust extraction port is. I hate that it's in metric, but I mean, these are pretty nitpicky things. On the whole, it does a really good job and is really fast. The other caution I would give you is once you get one, I do think it will be easy to get pulled into their whole universe of tools because everything just fits together. It perfectly connects to this dust extractor that also fits your sander. And so, like, those are the only two Festool tools that I own. And I don't really plan to get any more, but I could see how your entire shop gets covered in lime green once you get started with these tools. Like I said, it just makes joinery really fast and easy and accurate. And you can see how quickly these joints went together perfectly. Now it was time to glue the assemblies together. And this was a pretty simple glue up. My only kind of concern was that there wasn't a lot of clamping space. I could barely fit 2 clamps in on the area that I needed pressure, and I was really worried about it causing it to kind of buckle or bow upwards. So I was just sure not to apply too much pressure whenever I was tightening everything down. And then I used a framing square just to make sure that everything stayed nice and square. And I had to use my framing square because my little like woodworking squares weren't big enough to reach across that arch because I needed to check the outside of the leg against that stretcher, maybe about 6 inches inward, where it flattened out and I could actually check for square. I only have one set of 6-foot clamps, and so I had to pull out the big daddies for this one. These 10-foot clamps were overkill, but it's what I have. And I will say I hardly ever use these clamps. And so I got these pipe clamps at a garage sale and I hate them. I need to replace them with my Bessie clamps because they function just so much better. Also, just a note that I was out here early working this when I did this glue up, and one problem that I've always had is that there's no lighting over my workbench, and that's because my garage door opens right there and blocks off the ceiling, so I've never bothered to install anything more. But I bought these cheap lights from Amazon, and they're so light that I just used packaging tape to tape them to my garage door. And so now if I'm out there early in the morning and the door is open, I can run an extension cord to them, and now I have adequate lighting when I'm working early in the mornings. Now we can finally use our templates to route our workpiece. And I was taking really shallow passes here with my router because I was getting really bad tear out on this beach. And so I just used the template to route a very small groove along the top, and then I popped the templates off and then used that as my reference for my router bit. So I rode the bearing along the very top edge of the workpiece. And I just did this because the longer you have the template on there, I just figure the worse your odds of shifting or anything like that. So once I got a nice reference surface, I prefer to actually work off of the workpiece. And I kept dropping my router bit, just very small passes each time, and kept working until I got down to the very bottom of the workpiece, at which point I flipped it over and I used a bottom bearing template bit to clean up the last pass. At this point, I just needed to join the 2 leg assemblies together using these 2 cross members. And I was just trying to figure out basically how far apart I wanted the leg assemblies, what kind of overhang I wanted on this table. And so I planned to join the two leg assemblies together using some version of a mortise and tenon. I'm not sure, maybe it's just a plain mortise and tenon, but I didn't cut a tenon on the ends of these. Like, I didn't put any shoulders on them or anything like that. I just housed the entire part inside the leg assembly. And so to cut these to length, I basically needed to know how far apart I wanted these leg assemblies, and then I needed to actually pocket out for these cross members, and that means I needed to put the round over on the cross members. In the end, I went with a 5/16 round over. This beach, it is really easy to work with, but I did get a lot of like tear out on the router. So I started with a smaller router bit and dropped it down slowly and then moved to my bigger router bit. Anytime that I'm routing something on my last pass, I actually leave it at the same depth and run a climb cut. And I'm not necessarily recommending that you do this because climb cutting can be really dangerous, but I find that when it's at the exact same level, you're removing such a small amount of material that it's not really grabby. But this does remove just the thinnest layer of material and generally gets rid of any burn marks that you have, and then also can take care of any small fine tear out that you get. I needed to lay out 4 pockets in the exact same location of the legs. And so instead of doing that 4 individual times and potentially introducing error, I decided to lay it out once on my leg template and then use that as a guide for the rest of the legs. So I just used these scraps of wood, double-sided taped them down to where I wanted it on the leg template, routed out a hole. Then I took my leg template with the recess routed into it and used that as the guide for all of the pockets that I needed to do. And this helped to eliminate error, and it also made the process much faster. In order to make sure that my workpiece fit perfectly into these pockets right off of the router, I used a router bit that was twice the diameter of the round over that I used. So I rounded everything over with a 5/16 bit. So I used a 5/8 bit here on this pocket, and then everything fit in there nice and snug straight off the router. No cleanup required. While I was finishing up the base, I went ahead and took my tabletop over to Clyde's to have them surface it. And when I say that Clyde's is really close, what I mean is it's really close. This is the road that I take. I just take the Sturt Road down about a mile and I'm at his shop. So it's very convenient for me. So I finally have all of my parts kind of roughed out, and I can get an idea of what this table is going to look like. There's just a couple of things I want to note here. These tenons fit in there really, really tight, and I was actually worried about hydraulic lock when I went to go and glue these up. So I was realizing right here that I needed to do something about that, whether that was drill relief holes or chamfer the edges or do something like that. The other thing I wanted to note is I had gotten my tabletop back from Clyde, so it's already surfaced and flat. And your best bet at keeping a tabletop flat while you're working is to make sure that you never lay it flat on your work surface and just leave it. Right now, the weather changes daily on us. Sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's wet, sometimes it's dry. And if I leave this thing laying flat on a surface without any airflow around it, there's a decent chance that the wood could move and cause me problems. So everything is starting to come together. Next week, I'm going to work on the frame for the tabletop and then also just finishing up and cleaning up the parts for the base. So I'll see you next week, and thanks for watching.